Welcome to our sessions, and we are in a series of sessions on urban and heat planning journeys. And this one is the third one. We have so far completed two. Already one was on systems and the urban, and then another one already on heat. This is the second session on heat, but the third in a series, and we have two more to go. This particular session will be recorded. So in case you prefer not to be recorded, please let us know somewhere there in the chat. But it's recorded for the purposes of other people who are not able to join today to access it. And today we'll join Carl and Nuha, who will be our leading knowledge inspirers. Yes. So I'll give them a chance to introduce themselves. I would also like to invite you there to introduce yourself in the chat, and preferably when you tell us what you do or wherever you're joining from, and tell us what's the temperature like in your city. For example, I mentioned I'm joining from Tanzania. The city is called Tanga, Tanzania, and I just checked on my phone and I realized that right now it's 28 degrees Celsius. I would like to then pass over to Carl, also to introduce himself. And as I wait for you to introduce yourselves in the chat, our beloved participants. Thanks, Carl. Introduce yourself and you can pass back to me.
Thanks, Eddie, and lovely to meet everyone on the call. My name's Carl Asbury. I'm the lead for Climate and Health at the Resilient Cities Network and leading the UCRP programme in Greater Manchester. As far as what the temperature is currently where I am, 19 degrees, which is quite warm for this time of year. So I'm calling from the UK in Manchester, which is famed for its rain. So it's a bright sunny day today, so it's very nice. But thanks for the introduction, Eddie, and I'll hand back over to you.
Thank you very much, Carl. We are going to have what we call the diversity of temperatures and cities today. And so far, my city is so far leading in terms of temperatures. If there are any prizes to be won, of course, we are laboring to get the cities adapt to the extreme heat. What's your city like? I can see Luciana joining from El Salvador, and it is 25 degrees C. Tanga is still leading, so to say. Yay, we are seeing here Kel from Mexico City, 15 degrees C. And we heard from Carl, it was 19 degrees C, right? Please tell us where you are joining from. My colleague Luciana, please confirm that Noha is on the call so I could invite her to also introduce. We need, just joined. Not yet. Okay, good. Participants, we are eager to know the rest.
Here. Yes.
Noah is here. Noah, you're most welcome.
Thank you, and apologies. There has been technical issues. Thanks for your patience.
Absolutely.
Sorry about the technical issues.
Absolutely, this is acceptable. Internet and technical issues always happen. Noah, you'll see in the chat we are in a race to see the hottest city represented here. Mine was leading earlier on with 28 degrees C. I'm joining from Tanga, Tanzania, but I've seen that someone from Senegal, I can't even pronounce the name of the city, is now leading with 30 degrees C. We would like to invite you to introduce yourself briefly and tell us what the temperature is like in the city where you're joining from. Over. Georgia from the UK, it's 21 degrees C. Hey, Noah, you can unmute for you have the speaker rights.
Well, thank you. I was just typing in the chat as well.
No. Please unmute, do a brief introduction, and then I'll pass over the microphone to Carl. Hoping by then even we would have had which one is the hottest city right now represented. Over to you.
Thank you. So I'll go ahead, Eddie, with introductions, isn't it? Yes.
Right. Yes.
Okay, so hello and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Noah Eltine. I am a senior urban resilience and climate adaptation expert. I work at ECLAI, Local Government for Sustainability, which is a network of around 2,500 cities around the world. And we work in particular with city authorities, looking into issues around climate adaptation and urban resilience. And it's a pleasure to be here with you today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And you'll tell us in the chat if you are likely to win the prize of the hottest city today. Today, breaking. So far, we have TS. I think it is. Oh, whoa. Well, it's a tie. It's a tie. I see Wongani joining from Malawi. Lilongwe is 30 degrees C, as well as Senegal in I think TS in Senegal. Thank you very much. At this point, I would like now to start off our inspiration by inviting Carl to present to us, give us inspirations on building resilience for urban areas on the aspect of heat. Over to you. Thanks.
Thanks, Eddie. And hopefully my shares and my slides can be seen. I've shared them successfully. I've passed the first test. That's good. And hopefully I can be inspirational. Let's wait and see. But it's an absolute pleasure to join this call. I'm honoured to discuss urban resilience, which is something which we think about and have been thinking about for quite a number of years. And we see resilience as something which is increasingly vital as cities around the world face both traditional and new challenges. And we all know that cities are the engines of global growth, but they're also uniquely vulnerable to a range of shocks and stresses that threaten their ability to function. So first of all, I'd like to kind of cover what do we actually mean when we talk about resilience. So for us, resilience is the capacity of a system, whether that's a city, a community, or an institution, to maintain or recover its functionality when faced with disruption. And crucially, resilience goes beyond merely surviving a crisis. It's about retaining the essential character and structure of the system whilst continuing to operate under stress. And it's about adapting and evolving rather than simply returning to the status quo. And in the best cases, it means bouncing forward to a stronger, more sustainable state. Now, what's unique about urban resilience is that it's an interdisciplinary concept. And to truly understand and apply resilience in cities, we need to draw from several fields. In ecology, resilience refers to the ability of a natural system to absorb disturbance and to continue to function. And we see this in forests or wetlands, which can adapt to fires or floods without losing their core functionality. And then from structural engineering, we learn about how buildings and infrastructure can return to a steady state after disruptions, such as earthquakes or extreme weather events. And so this resilience field, helps us design cities that can sustain their essential operations, even during a crisis. So urban resilience is all of those things. It's physical, it's social, it's environmental, it's holistic. And we want to create resilient cities that don't just bounce back, but evolve into more equitable, sustainable and inclusive places. Now, I'd like to talk about the specific challenges that cities face, both acute shocks and chronic stresses. And these, to me, are the two sides of the resilience coin. But both, sometimes we focus too much on we focus solely maybe on the shocks, but both shocks and stresses and the interrelation between those two concepts are equally important. So acute shocks They're the sudden, sharp events that threaten a city's ability to function. And these are the crises like fires, floods, earthquakes, disease outbreaks, or even terrorist attacks. They hit quickly, often without warning, and can cause significant damage in a very short period of time. And when we think of disasters, there's some images that come to mind. The scenes of devastation where cities are literally brought to a standstill. But what we sometimes forget is that cities are also constantly under pressure from chronic stresses. And these are the slow-moving challenges that wear down a city's systems over time. And these stresses include things like climate change, poverty, food insecurity, economic inequality, homelessness, and there's more. And unlike acute shocks, chronic stresses may not grab the headlines, but they are no less dangerous. They can weaken the social, economic, and physical fabric of a city, leaving it vulnerable to future shocks. And we can consider climate change as both a shock and a stress. In the short term, we face acute events like heat waves or flooding. But over the longer term, rising temperatures, droughts, and sea level rise create persistent stresses on cities, disrupting ecosystems, disrupting economies, and harming human health. But there is hope. This is the optimism bit, Eddie. These shocks and stresses also create opportunities for cities to evolve and transform. And this is not just about bouncing back. We don't necessarily want to go back to the status quo. That isn't always desirable, especially if that status quo involves systemic inequality or environmental degradation. Instead, resilience gives us a framework for bouncing forward. We can rebuild in ways that are more inclusive, more sustainable, and more equitable. And cities are not just passive victims of these shocks and stresses. They can actively use these disruptions to drive positive change. You could take the example of New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. They didn't just rebuild the levees and the homes. It took the opportunity to rethink urban planning, rethink green infrastructure, and rethink, really importantly, about community engagement and involvement and empowerment. And the goal was not just to recover, but to build a more resilient and equitable city that is better prepared for future challenges. I'd like to introduce a powerful concept, what we call the resilience dividend. And this is a key part of why urban resilience is so important. When we talk about resilience, we've just been talking about how cities can better withstand shocks and stresses. But resilience also generates a range of broader benefits that go beyond the immediate response to a crisis. And these benefits are what we call the resilience dividend. So what is that dividend? Put simply, it's the value that resilience creates for cities in day-to-day living, not just times of crisis. So by investing in resilience, cities don't just prepare for disasters, they also improve public health, expand access to services, create jobs, and foster social cohesion. For example, when a city invests in upgrading its transportation systems to be more resilient to climate impacts, this also has day-to-day benefits. Residents have more reliable and accessible transportation, which improves their quality of life and connects them to job opportunities. Similarly, green infrastructure projects designed to reduce flooding, such as parks and wetlands, provide recreational spaces for residents and help improve air quality. The net zero agenda is a great example of how resilience and sustainability go hand in hand. So when cities invest in low carbon infrastructure and renewable energy, they reduce their vulnerability to climate shocks, whilst also driving economic growth through job creation in green industries. So what I'm trying to get at is by thinking holistically about resilience, we can unlock this dividend, whatever that means for a particular place, and it is different in different places, and ultimately trying to make cities healthier, more inclusive, and more prosperous, even in times of stability. So let's move over to focus a bit more on urban heat and taking an urban resilience approach to urban heat. So climate drivers, such as rising temperatures and extreme weather, influence exposure pathways that lead to specific health outcomes. And I'm focusing here on health. And this exposure pathway diagram outlines how climate drivers influence urban and environmental systems leading to specific health outcomes. And it importantly highlights the critical role of equity in mediating these impacts, reinforcing the need for really inclusive resilience strategies and projects. And this reinforces, again, the need for an integrated approach to urban planning that considers both environmental and social factors. And taking a holistic systems thinking approach, I'll highlight the interconnected and interdependent nature of various factors that influence urban resilience. So rather than viewing and analysing climate events, health outcomes, and urban stresses in isolation, systems thinking compels us to consider how these elements interact, compound one another, and create feedback loops that can either exacerbate or mitigate the overall impact on urban populations. And I'll be sharing these slides. I don't expect you to take this diagram in all at once. We'll share these slides, but to give an example, you may have a climate-related shock like a heat wave. And that not only directly affects public health through heat-related illnesses, but it also strains water, food, and energy systems, disrupts economic activities and production systems, creates conditions for wildfires, and amplifies pre-existing social inequalities. So this diagram is trying to get at the, and emphasize the interconnectedness of these components, where climate events, cascading shocks, and urban stresses do not operate in isolation, but are deeply intertwined with inequalities and health outcomes. For example, climate shocks can trigger or worsen urban stresses, such as infrastructure failure or food insecurity. And that can in turn lead to health crises. And similarly, existing inequalities can make certain populations more vulnerable to these shocks and stresses, while the resultant health impact can further entrench these inequalities. So you can see how the compounded effects of these factors can create a feedback loop where the impacts of one event exacerbate the conditions that lead to another, creating a cycle of increasing vulnerability and diminishing resilience. So let's move on to a bit of hope and a case study here on Athens' work on addressing heat risk. So Athens is one of the leading examples of a city that has tackled extreme heat through a comprehensive, resilient approach. And as you know, heat waves are becoming more frequent and intense, especially in Southern Europe, where urban areas face significant risks from rising temperatures. And Athens has developed a three-pillar approach to address these risks: awareness, preparedness, and redesign. First, under the awareness pillar, Athens has focused on public education campaigns. And this is crucial because one of the greatest risks during a heat wave is a lack of information. People don't know how to protect themselves. So Athens launched community engagement efforts to disseminate information on heat risks, particularly targeting vulnerable populations such as the elderly, young people, and people with pre-existing health conditions. And they've worked with local community organisations to ensure the message reaches everyone. And really importantly, they institutionalised the issue of heat across the city system with the introduction of the world's first chief heat officer. The second, in terms of preparedness, they've developed robust emergency planning protocols. And this includes early warning systems like the Extrema Global app, which alerts residents to upcoming heat waves and provides advice on how to stay safe. Emergency drills have been conducted to ensure that the city's response systems are ready, and resources have been allocated to support vulnerable populations during extreme heat events. And this includes things like the setting up of cooling centres and hydration stations placed strategically throughout the city. And I believe that response and preparation support has actually come from the National Red Cross in Greece to support Athens with that work. And the third pillar is redesign. So here Athens is leading the way in using urban planning to make the city more resilient to heat. So they've introduced heat-resistant materials like cool roofs and cool pavements, which reflect more sunlight and reduce the urban heat island effect. They've invested in green infrastructure, planting more trees and creating green spaces and green walls and green roofs that provide shade and help cool the air. And so this approach isn't just about surviving the heat, is trying to make the city more livable and healthier for everyone. And I'll move on to another case study, which is the Oasis schoolyards. And this comes from Paris, where the city has transformed its schoolyards into some schoolyards into climate resilient, multifunctional spaces through what they've called the Oasis Schoolyards program. They piloted the program in 10 schoolyards as part of its broader Paris resilience strategy, and today that number has scaled and grown, and I think it's at 72 now. And why did they focus on schoolyards? Because they represent an important opportunity for cities to address multiple challenges at once: the lack of green areas, the need for safe and engaging spaces for children, and the necessity for adapting urban areas to rising temperatures. And it goes beyond just adapting spaces to climate change. They also serve as an educational tool. They're designed to teach children about nature, climate resilience, and sustainability. And by involving students in the process, whether through planting trees or helping to maintain these green spaces, the programme fosters a deep experiential understanding of environmental stewardship. And this co-design approach ensures that the schoolyards meet the needs and desires of the students and the local communities. So teachers, students, and community members collaborate together to design and implement these spaces. So, for example, students have requested shaded areas, water features, and natural materials. And all this is making their learning environment cooler, greener, and more conducive to outdoor activities. And another aspect of the programme is that it opens these spaces to the broader community. So on weekends or after school hours, the schoolyards become public spaces where local residents can gather, relax, and enjoy the greenery, and relieve themselves of extreme heat when there are heatwave events. And that initiative has helped strengthen social cohesion by creating safe, accessible places for the community to interact. So, and this project, moreover, has had a significant impact on urban heat reduction. So there's multiple studies that show that green infrastructure, such as what we've just talked about and what's been incorporated into the schoolyards, can lower temperatures by several degrees in urban areas. So by introducing trees, cool pavements, green roofs, you're not just creating, you're creating cool islands. Areas that provide relief from the heat, not only for the school children, but also for the wider neighbourhood. And we're adapting the Paris Oasis programme into other programmes that we're running. So we're running an Oasis schoolyards programme in the Philippines and Indonesia. And there the programme will transform 3 schoolyards into urban oases using nature-based solutions to combat both heat and flooding. And the aim is hopefully to scale these projects throughout Asia, showing how local solutions can have global applications. So I'm going to end with some tips, I think. It's difficult to come up with these, but some top tips. This is for anyone who's leading any climate adaptation or climate resilience related work, any projects within cities. Particularly if you are involved in the UCRP programme. And there's some lessons, I think, from the work that we've done that potentially are helpful for you guys. So I think it's crucial, wherever possible, to embed your programme or your project into city governance structures. And that really helps ensure continuity and sustainability, even where there are changes in political leadership or funding priorities. And it also helps build the case and the opportunities for scale, which is really important, and ensures high levels of visibility, particularly at senior levels. And importantly, enables cities to own projects into the longer term. Next, we found that using the CRMC data is really important for understanding the risks and vulnerabilities within a city. So this data helps cities, and helps us target interventions much more effectively, ensuring that resources go where they're most needed. However, it's also important to not be overly constrained by the data. So it provides a foundation, but you've got to remain flexible and innovative in your approach. And local knowledge and community input, however that comes in, just as important as technical data in designing effective resilience solutions. Another key factor is building trust and partnerships with community-based organisations, and that will be a key factor in the success or otherwise. And these organisations have deep connections within their neighbourhoods who can provide invaluable insights into the needs and priorities of the local population. And it's about building trust within the communities, ensuring that resilience projects have community buy-in and support from the people who will benefit most from them. And I know the Red Cross and other organisations are slightly different to the Resilient Cities Network in that you've got, in many places actually, you've got those networks and you've got that trust and partnership already in place, so that this may not be applicable to some of you. But we've also learned that communication is really critical at every stage of the process. So it's not enough to simply implement a resilience project. You've got to take the opportunity to communicate the value of these programs to the public, to stakeholders and to decision makers. And this will help ensure continued support, both politically and financially, and hopefully help build a culture of resilience within the city. And finally, we've got to adopt a holistic approach. And this is what we've been talking about at the beginning of my presentation. It's not just about physical infrastructure. It's about addressing the social, economic and environmental factors that make a city vulnerable. And if you take this comprehensive view, it opens up new forms of collaboration and new forms of funding. There's multiple sectors, whether that's health, transportation, education, other sectors will come together to build stronger, more resilient projects, strategies and cities. And one of the most important lessons is that crises can be real opportunities for transformation. So it's during moments of disruption that cities can reimagine themselves, potentially, putting in place systems and structures that will better serve them in the future. So this goes back to what I talked about at the beginning. It's what we call the resilience dividend. The idea that building resilience doesn't just protect against shocks, it also creates immediate and long-term benefits for the entire urban system. So hopefully some of this has been helpful. I've promised I'd share the slides and some of the resources that you will receive after this session. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I'd like to thank everyone and see if there's any questions and hand over to Luciana.
Hi, Carl. Thank you so much for that amazing presentation and that last key message that was really amazing about how crisis is this opportunity for transformation. And so talking about that, I think it's a great moment now for us to meet in breakout rooms. So you'll have around 7 minutes to meet with each other. Georgia will help me here sharing the screen with some reflections that can help us guide this conversation in the breakout room. And when we come back, you'll also have the opportunity to ask Carl any other questions you may have related to his presentation. So in this breakout room, I encourage you to speak about the things you reflected from this session, any important points, but also we can talk about what did we learn from some of these approaches to heat resilience, and how can we establish similar strategies in our local context. So Georgia now is going to help me put everyone in breakout rooms, and yeah, have a great conversation, everybody. See you in a bit.
And also thanks, Carl, for the very interesting, I would say, introductions and insight as well from your presentation, and also the reflections from the participants. It was really interesting, and it links very well to what we'll also be speaking more about here. So in my presentation today, if you go into the next slide, you will see the session overview, which is basically starting by understanding more about why urban heat, obviously for a lot of the reasons that Carl have mentioned, and also all of us in the discussion today are aware of. But it's always important to emphasize looking at facts and figures, but also future projections, and start thinking about what needs to be done there. Also, in particular, focusing on urban heat island, what do we mean by that? And then go more into the conceptual understanding of critical infrastructure. Again, a bit of definitions, a bit of research, but also reflecting on what does that mean when it comes into building resilience at the community levels and the decision-making process. And then we start highlighting in when we speak about infrastructure on social infrastructure in particular and social capital. And that also, I was really interested to hear from the discussions some of the comments around the social networks, which is something that I would emphasize on a lot in our presentation today. And then going into social institutional support and how that is something that we are in particular in the UCRP program now are looking into, and then giving few examples of existing projects that we are working on and as well as initiatives that we are engaged in. So with that, I'm going to the next slide, which is more of an introductory slide about who we are, what ICLEI is. So in my brief intros earlier, I've just mentioned that we are a city network, but we also have offices across the world, worldwide, around 22 offices. And I work personally for the European Secretariat, which is based in Freiburg in Germany. So we have over 170 members, but we also do have members all across the world, and we focus a lot on works and different activities, as you see at the bottom of the slide. But when we go into more focusing on the topic of our presentation today and why urban heat, when you go into the next slide, you can see that from the map that has been produced recently in the European Environmental Agency report, and starting with giving an overview on that status, extreme weather events have already accumulated a huge amount of fatalities, around 145,000 human fatalities in Europe over the past 40 years. But over 80% of those are caused by heat waves, which is a very important message and very important figures that we need to look into again and think about it. What is it exactly that we are missing when it comes into city administration, but also local communities? Is it only about the physical infrastructure and the data that we are providing, early warning systems, or is it actually about the actions of individuals and the support that the community build together by developing their social infrastructure systems? So with that, also it's important to also link that into the high emissions scenarios. Yes, can you hear me?
Sorry, Noha.
Yes, please.
We can hear you, but I think we are still on a different slide that summarizes ICLEI's reach.
Yes, so if you don't mind going into the next slide, please. Yes, so that's the one I was just mentioning in terms of the facts and figures on extreme weather events. The accumulation of fatalities in Europe over the past 40 years, and then 85% of those fatalities are due to heat waves. So bringing this into the point and also reflecting on that, where I was just mentioning how we also need to consider this when it comes into future projections, so actions that are required at the community level, at the individual level, but also at the city administration level, and also keeping in mind the global warming. And if that increases into 3 degrees Celsius by 21 zeros, that means that we have a huge number of fatalities that are going to be due to the extreme heat events. So what is also important when we look into those figures, that when we speak about urban heats, it's important that we also look into that frequency of events, the vulnerabilities, morbidity and mortality rates, but also health and safety consequences. And when we look into that, when we speak about it and link into it into critical infrastructure, what does that actually mean for hospitals and the facilities that we have? What does it mean for schools? What does it mean for public spaces that people are using? And I'm happy that Kai have shared with us very interesting examples in the previous presentation. But what I will speak more about, adding to what have been shared, if we go into the next slide, which is we come to see here more focus on understanding what Urban Heat Island is about. And the illustration describes basically the factors that contribute into that, as well as the factors that can help mitigate the impact of urban heat islands. Because with that, we can understand not only the causes, but also the solutions that we can apply. And one of those solutions, which is the cool roofs that I'm going to speak about, but definitely there are other solutions, as we've seen from Athens and from Paris and other parts of the world. And maybe in the breakout room later on, I would love to hear also from your context and from your cities, what other solutions have been implemented in other contexts. But in summary, what we see here in that image back again is the increase in the high surface temperatures leading to elevated air temperatures and specifically at nighttime, increasing heat, and most importantly, affecting the most disadvantaged communities, people who do not have access to electric cooling systems or even other facilities where they can actually have mechanisms to reduce the impact of urban heat islands. So this is something that, as I mentioned, needs to be highly considered, specifically for the most vulnerable, elderly people and children. And what also I want just to reflect on here before we go into the next slide, that despite that all of the information that I've mentioned is something that most of us are aware of, and cities have a lot of this climate data and forecasts, but unfortunately, we have not seen immediate actions at the global scale when it comes into spatial and temporal solutions that are actually suitable for local decision making. So it's very, very critical here to understand that when we speak about infrastructure, it's not about the data that we provide, but actually how that data is being used and how is it actually being well understood by the let's say, the end users in order to help them build resilience for the most vulnerable. So if we go into the next slide, and that's maybe reflects more on what I was trying to explain earlier in terms of understanding what infrastructure is all about. So to better understand how cities can leverage data for resilient critical infrastructure and in focusing in particular on urban heat, we need to understand first what infrastructure means. And as you see from the definition here, it's the basic physical and organizational structures, facilities, building, roads that are needed for operation and providing services for the society. But unfortunately, that definition also only focuses on the physical element. So if you just click, you will come into another box that will show at the bottom of the screen that is showing critical infrastructure as being defined by the UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, which is the physical structure, the facilities and networks that are important to provide the services, but also to the social and economic function of the community or a society. So that means that the elements of the social capital are extremely important, the elements of data are extremely important, and how that all feed into the city ecosystem to ensure that the services that are being provided by the city are actually addressing the challenges of the most vulnerable. So with that, and by understanding of this mechanism, is also in the next slide, I try to highlight that more in terms of understanding of terms and definitions. And here is something that have been strongly emphasized by both the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction and also the Sustainable Development Goals, and in particular focusing on target D for the Sendai framework, which is the direct disaster economic losses, trying to reduce that in relation to the global GDP and including disasters damage to critical infrastructure and disruption of basic services, which is again highlights that it's not only an agenda that is being set as a priority locally, but also globally. Having said that, it's also important that we not forget that when we look into these targets, we have also to underline that the limitations and, let's say, the gaps that these targets set. They do provide this bigger umbrella, but they also come with a caveat, because if we look into target D in particular, and the terms damage, critical infrastructure, disruption, basic services, they all highlight different contexts in different cities, and as we all know, each city has its own context and its own characters. So how do we actually translate those terms into the local context is the biggest question mark that we have here, to ensure that the understanding of loss and disaster loss, and in this particular situation, we're speaking about urban heat, it's also associated with timeframes, it's associated with scale, it's even associated with what we call resilience assessment processes, and that's what we are applying, for example, in the UCRP program. So these interpretations of all of these terminologies are critically important to identify the level of losses, the interruptions that happens, for example, when it's extremely hot. We have those in certain cases where we have electricity cuts down due to the very high pressure and the high demand. So how do we actually manage also to look into the interdependencies and when a critical infrastructure is being affected, and how does that have this ripple effect on other services within the city and within the city system. So if we go into the next slide, linking what I have mentioned earlier about the physical infrastructure into the social infrastructure and the social capital, or what we try to emphasize here, and the key message that I would like to reflect on, is that investing in physical infrastructure is important, but it might restrict our understanding of the social and the institutional elements of actually tackling the problems when it comes into heat stress and developing adaptation solutions. Because these, in some cases, and I'm sure that specifically in other parts of the world, not only from Europe, there's a lot of very interesting lessons that we can learn of how social bonds between and within the community can actually strengthen resilience efforts against heat waves and other disasters risks. So social capital in disaster context is extremely important to be captured, but also to be mobilized in developing resilience solutions when it comes into heat stresses, but also other climate stresses. So civic assets, community engagement and connectivity, they all come together in building these bonds and try to invest into it. So once we are starting to develop resilience solution, it's not only by maybe building a dam when it comes into flooding, or maybe advancing early warning system when it comes into heat waves, but actually how that data is actually used and how can it mobilize the existing resources that we have within our social infrastructure within our cities. If we go into the next slide, and that's going to be linked more into the project that we are currently working on, which is the Urban Global Resilient Program, where we are implementing the project at the moment in Izmir in Turkey. And what we are trying to focus on is how the indigenous support and the mechanisms that are already developed within the local communities can be capitalized in order to translate that into more adaptive actions in response to heat waves, but also how the social networks within the communities and the institution can determine this ability of exchanging information and exchanging resources, not forgetting, for example, in the context of Izmir, that we are speaking about a coastal city that have a very high level of migration, and also communities coming from different backgrounds and different contexts, different levels of vulnerabilities, but also different capacities in response to risk and risk management that we can explore and capitalize. And how, and most importantly, how do these people come together? And that's what we call the social institutional support network. So what we're trying to map at the moment is how these communities are coming together, where actually are they coming together, and how those spaces of connecting those networks are actually being places for innovation that we can start looking and developing resilience solutions from there. So in the next slide, you can see that this is one of the meetings that we had back with the communities in January, and where we were starting to addressing the issues of heat waves, understanding how women actually have been responding to the problems of heat, what measures of preparedness are actually taking place there, how they actually starting to paint their own roofs, because this is what is affordable and this is what is accessible for them. Maybe also putting some sheets to cover certain areas, but also speaking about their challenges when it comes into access to public spaces and green spaces, and how maybe facilitating safer access for women into those spaces can actually support with their mechanisms in hot days and responding to heat waves. And then in the next slide, and this is what also the social institutional support network is actually a mechanism that is not only looking into quantitative data, but also qualitative data. And that's something that the UCRP and the CRMC tool in particular is interesting in capturing that, because when we speak about the human behavioral elements of adaptation, and how that is really embedded into the socioeconomic and the cultural context of regions, and also related into the human culture and backgrounds. So these actually helps us a lot in understanding the complexity and have what we call the proximity into understanding the cultural habits, and how that can be mobilized into resources in developing climate adaptation solutions. Now, with that and having this quick, I would say, overview, I will end up by sharing just quick 2 examples from another 2 projects that we are working on. The first one, which is the cool roofs. The Google EIE, which is the Google EIE, which is the Environmental Insights Explorer. And that the reason why I'm also sharing this example of the project, because I'm trying to also emphasize on the element of data and how data as one of the components of infrastructure, as you've seen in the slide earlier, the physical, the social, and the digital component. So here, the digital component is being introduced, and also in particular cool roofs, because not only for the project that we are implementing, but I also came across a very interesting study that has been published recently by UCL in July 2024, where you see the image at the back there for the City of London, where what this study have actually tried to do is to look into different mechanisms for tackling urban heat challenges, and how the different, I would say, solutions that are being applied across the city, not only the cool roofs, but for example, extensive street level vegetation using solar panels or even smaller net cooling effects. They have realized that cool roofs, in compared to all of the other mechanisms that has been applied, have managed to reduce the temperature or across the city on average for about 2 degrees in some locations, or 1.2 degrees, in compared to other systems that only have put the degrees down into 0.3. So here you can really see what the impact of cool roofs can do in compared to other measures that we can apply. And as part of the work that we're doing at ICLEI together with the Google EIE, and the project is actually aiming to use the data that is being developed by Google to enable cities to take actions on heat waves, by indicating where are these hot and cool spots within the cities, and then deciding on where or how to prioritize investments into reducing the impact of urban heat waves. So this is one project, and then I will end up by a very last example of an initiative that we are actually taking part in, which is the Global Heat Resilience Service. And what is also interesting about this initiative, that it's not only looking into data within cities, but how that data is being used, and what type, or actually how can we measure those outcomes when it comes into managing urban heat waves, moving from the meteorological data using the satellite-based mapping systems and the community-based mapping apps, just like also what Carl have, for example, shared with us on the extreme events in Athens, and then the socioeconomic and the public health data, and that's where the social infrastructure comes in to develop more or stronger outputs and outcomes. And I'm just being mindful of time, so I'll very quickly end up with the very last slide, where more of the recommendations comes in. So how can we actually use all of this information, the social infrastructures, the social infrastructure network systems? How do we actually use the data and link that into the physical infrastructure? That has to happen across all levels of risk governance. So starting from national governments, linking that into the public health authorities, how the urban planning are informing the design and the construction of building and public spaces, how the community members are being engaged, and most importantly, the private sector to help mobilize investments for more sustainable and resilient solutions. So I will end up there, and thank you all.